30 years ago, Susan Smith went to prison for the infamous murder of her 2 young sons. In 2024, she came up for parole but was denied. Just how bad is her life in prison? It may surprise you. From the beginning, Smith was far from a model inmate. A file obtained by People revealed Smith had committed a variety of serious infractions, including self-mutilation and possession of contraband. She was also disciplined twice for drug-related incidents, losing her visitation, canteen, and phone privileges for a year each time. And in the early 2000s, 2 prison guards admitted to having sexual relationships with Smith. The officers pled guilty, and Smith was transferred to the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina, where she remains. Although this was another black mark in her record, the abuse of power aspect of these incidents shouldn't be ignored. But in 2020, a source inside the prison told People that Smith had suddenly started behaving herself. They explained, she knows that her parole date is 4 years away and she can't get parole if she isn't being good. After 29 years behind bars, Smith came before the parole board on November 20th, 2024. She participated from prison through a video link. Throughout the proceeding, a tearful Smith was asked questions about the disciplinary infractions she committed during her time in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Her weepy response boiled down to 2 words.
Just stupidity.
Smith was contrite-ish and went on to say what was expected.
I know I made a lot of mistakes in here, and I have learned from them.
However, after acknowledging her own growth and desire to make amends, the parole board still wasn't done with her. Above all, Smith needed to show remorse. Before the parole board could rule, she took a moment to admit that she understood and took responsibility for killing her boys.
I know that what I did was so horrible. And I would give anything if I could go back and change it.
But Smith wasn't a victim. Smith's ex-husband, David, the boy's father, was there to speak for them and tell his side of the story. He appeared on screen with over a dozen supporters, including family members, legal representatives, and key members of the original prosecution team, all of whom pleaded with the authorities to deny Smith's request to be released.
This wasn't a tragic mistake. She purposely meant to end their life.
And it seems the parole panel took his words to heart. They voted unanimously to keep Smith locked up. For the unfamiliar who need a recap, the Susan Smith case was one of the most heinous and most publicized crimes of the 90s. On October 25, 1994, the 23-year-old Smith took her sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, out for a ride. Hours later, she called emergency services, frantic, claiming that an unknown black man had carjacked her and kidnapped the kids.
We will do anything we will to help you to get them home back to us.
For 9 days, Smith and her ex-husband David repeatedly appeared on television, begging for their safe return.
She looks at David and almost giggles like, we're going to be on TV.
Police quickly began to realize her story didn't add up, and they were right. How could someone be capable of such a horrendous crime? As a child, Smith had a lengthy history of untreated mental illness. She attempted suicide at 13 and was sexually abused by her stepfather, Beverly Russell, throughout her high school years. Although she reported the abuse to her school counselor, her stepfather, who was a prominent member of the Christian Coalition and the South Carolina Republican Party, managed to get the charges dropped. During Smith's trial, Russell admitted to molesting her in her teens and continuing an affair with her even after she was married.
They went from Susan the monster in January to Susan the victim in July.
After graduating from high school, Susan met and married David Smith, and they had 2 boys. Their marriage wasn't smooth sailing, however. There were periods of separation until their final split around 1994, which laid the groundwork for the tragedy to come. Soon after her marriage ended, Smith fell head over heels for a man named Tom Findley, but Findley, described by the New York Times as the son of a rich industrialist, broke up with Smith by letter in the fall of '94, explaining that he didn't want kids. Smith's 2 sons were a deal breaker. Smith apparently decided she couldn't live without Findley, so on the night of October 25th, she drove her children to a nearby lake, strapped them into their car seats, and rolled the car into the water. She then concocted the black carjacker story, temporarily winning the public over with her lies, but on November 3rd, she confessed to the murders.
The defense claimed a botched suicide, but she was able to save herself. She was able to blame a black guy. She wasn't wet.
After a highly publicized trial in which the death penalty was on the table, Smith was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. After Susan's 2024 parole hearing, David Smith mentioned in a press conference, that his ex-wife will be able to seek parole again in 2 years, and when that time comes in 2026, he'll be back to advocate against her.
I haven't seen any remorse from her.
However, it seems that Susan Smith's legal team might be using these next 2 years to hatch a different strategy to gain her freedom. Back in 2015, Smith wrote a letter to The State, a local South Carolina newspaper, to try and take control of her own narrative. In it, she claimed, "Something went very wrong that night. I was not myself. I was a good mother and I loved my boys. There was no motive as it was not even a planned event. I was not in my right mind. I am not the monster society thinks I am."
In one call that was recorded, she says, "I've done my time. It's enough."
Smith's attorney, Tommy A. Thomas, is most likely behind this attempt to try to prove she's a changed woman. Whereas Thomas pointed out the crimes Smith committed were indeed atrocities during her parole hearing, he was quick to revisit the horrors Smith herself had to endure throughout her life, and how they should be considered in order to better understand her and how she got to such a desperate place. However, even if Smith were to be released, Thomas said, "I don't think she will ever be able to forgive herself."